Welcome to Wholesale Change, the podcast and webcast from Distribution Strategy Group, where we provide thought leadership for wholesale change agents like you. I'm one of your co-hosts today. My name is Ian Heller. I'd like to bring in my business partner, my trusted friend, the tower of analytical power, the doctor of distribution, Jonathan Bine, PhD. How you doing today, Jonathan?
I'm well, Ian. How are you?
I'm doing great. You guys can see my screen okay? I can see your video fine. Okay, so we have a really interesting topic today. It's painless pricing improvements for distributors. You looking forward to this discussion, Jonathan?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think we've gotten a lot of input on this. It's funny, we try to get some feedback from our audience before we start, and we have a lot of ideas for this one, and we're hoping to get a lot more during the broadcast. So let's jump into the first slide, first and only slide today, and these are our favorite profit-driving hacks. And we've got about 9 of them here. We're going to get more from the audience as we go. Jonathan, do you want to take the first one?
You bet. There was a study done by McKinsey a number of years ago that showed the power of 1% of different things that you could do. So 1% reduction in COGS, 1% reduction in SG&A, 1% increase in revenue, 1% increase in margin. And it turned out that the increase in margin was by far the most significant effect on the bottom line. Their analysis showed, and I'm not sure why it required McKinsey to do this, if you can get another point of margin and you're a 10-point bottom line company, you just improved your bottom line by 10%. Now, not a ton of distributors have a 10-point bottom line, so the impact is going to be even greater if you get an additional point of pricing improvement. So if you're a 3% bottom line and you get another point of pricing margin, you just increase your profitability by 33%. An important underlying assumption here, some of you may be familiar with it, is that in general, things are a little bit less elastic than we think. So in other words, you can typically get that additional point of margin, or perhaps a couple of points of margin, without having much elasticity in what you're selling.
Yeah, I think, and this relates to the next point, the customers, I think, are a lot less sensitive to small markups than the customer service people are, who are often setting the prices, and I think in distribution, we're sort of afflicted with doing simple math. Everything's on a markup basis or maybe a gross margin basis. So I want to connect the two for the first 2 bullets for a second, Jonathan, and get the benefit of your experience here. But what I've seen is that there are an awful lot of salespeople and customer service people. And, if they're trying to set a price on something, they'll just do cost plus 20 or cost plus 15 or cost plus 25 or whatever. And the reality is there is not really any elasticity in these prices. So you could go, that cost plus 15 could be cost plus 17 or 18, and that cost plus 20 could be 21, 22, 23, et cetera. And no one would notice. It wouldn't cost you any sales. Is that your experience?
100%. And then if we tie it back to the previous point, so previous point's 1%. The examples you gave were 1%, 2%, and 3% increase in pricing. So 2% increase in pricing on a 3% bottom line is a 67% profit improvement.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of customer service people, they haven't had financial accounting and they aren't familiar with income statements, and they don't realize that, if you take a $30 item and you raise it by $1, that's a huge increase in profit. And it's not a very big increase on $30, but that profit all falls to the bottom line because none of the costs are changing just because you're raising the price by $1.
Yeah, and I think another piece in what you're saying about the round markups or discounts, conversely, is that 5% is a round markup, right? Or discount. So if you can do a 3.8% discount or a 3.75% discount instead of a 5%, you just got another point and a quarter for your company, and that's goodness.
Yeah, I think, in a lot of cases, people are in such a hurry for the product. I mean, so Amazon used to have this reputation for being the cheapest place in town. Does anybody really believe that anymore? I mean, especially with the third-party sellers, they're not necessarily an inexpensive place to buy things. People are not buying even from Amazon just based on price. They're buying because it's convenient and they can get it quickly. Well, the same holds true for distributors. You don't have to be the cheapest on everything. You need to provide good service and stand behind what you sell, and have the right technical advice and help people get the product how they want it. That's worth money to people.
Absolutely. And I think in retail, a lot of what happens in retail is smart retailers will figure out what are the set of things that I sell by which I will be judged on pricing. So it might be milk and butter, right?
Sure.
I'm judged as inexpensive, regular, or expensive based on prices of milk and butter, or maybe there's 100 items. And I think the similar thing's true in distribution. If you can get the pricing right on that set of items by which you are commonly judged, you can create the impression of what you want, that we are affordably priced, that we are at parity, or that we are more expensive. So
Image items.
Image items. Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Right.
Is that the term, by the way?
Yeah, well, I think so. That's the term we always used in my career, is that, the image items were the ones that set the impression in the mind of the customer about how competitive you were. So, years ago, if you were an HVAC distributor, the T87F, the round gold Honeywell thermostat, was an image item price, and people wanted to know what you charged for that. I mean, I remember in my own life when my kids were little, we would look in the Sunday paper to see which of the big discount stores had the cheapest Pampers, and we'd buy $500 worth of product from that store based on checking one item. And I think, it's a little bit different today, obviously, because of the internet, but still people are not, they're not cross shopping every little thing that they buy from you. They're looking for good service, and they're expecting you to be competitive and not, hurt them. They aren't expecting you to be the lowest price on everything. Actually, we have a comment. And it says, Ian, when we looked at first quartile, this is from one of our listeners. Ian, when we looked at first quartile versus average performers in the Jan-San industry across a number of variables, the difference in any one variable was very small, but the sum of those marginal differences added up to the difference between an average distributor and a top quartile distributor. So I think what he's saying is that the pricing differences on any given SKU tended to be very small, but you add them all up cumulatively, and it makes a huge difference in the profitability of the company, right?
Yep, it's a game of inches. So you get a few inches or microns on this deal and that deal. Pretty soon you add it up, and to the commenter's point, you're going to see a large aggregate effect.
So how do you implement this, Jonathan? I mean, when you're consulting with a client about pricing and they say, well, okay, great, but how do I get everybody to raise prices 1%, which is, a bit of an oversimplification. How do you go about making this happen in a real environment?
Well, I think to the commenter's point about the quartile, or we can go to deciles, you're typically not going to get a lot of price movement in your first decile. Your largest customers, you're typically not going to be able to raise prices much there. But one of the techniques that I think is well understood is if you look at bottom 8 deciles or bottom 4 quintiles, the bottom 80% of your customer base, you can push up the prices on C and D items to those customers 5, 10, 15, 20%. And you will get that 1 or 2 or 3 point lift at the bottom line. If you do the math, by the way, I mean, you can run this as your own experiment. See what would happen if you pushed up your C and D items to the bottom 80% of your customer base, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, and you'll see that it's a large aggregate effect. So I think recognizing that it's going to be harder to move those large customers, it's impossible to move like a power buyer, right? So if you're selling to a power buyer, it's going to be impossible to move them. But you can make good headway without much elasticity by pushing up those C&D items.
But how do you operationalize it? So here's getting some background.
Well, a lot of it depends on how the how people get a price within their company as a distributor. So is the CSR typically pulling it from an ERP system? So if you can get that into your ERP system, I think the better answer is to get a pricing system. The pricing systems will help you do this. So Sparks IQ used to be known as Strategic Pricing Associates, loads right into the ERP system. And it's transparent to a customer service rep who's pulling a price from there. If somebody's working with a pricing system, a Pros, a Zilliant, any of the other systems, they'll get it from the system. So I think to the extent that it's coming from a system and is relatively transparent to the person who's getting the price, that's going to be the best move.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing is you've got to teach basic profitability analytics to the people on the front lines. They need to understand that, cutting a price is a big deal. And we talked about this last week where, you sit with a customer service agent and they just give out discounts like it's another nice thing you do for your customers rather than it being the thing you do to get paid back for all the service you offer your customers. And so they need to not be so, reactionary and handing out discounts, and they need to charge more, but they have to understand the math behind it, because 1% doesn't sound like very much. And that applies to giving a 1% discount or charging more. 1% just doesn't seem like much. And so a lot of times they'll give away 5 and 10% is what I've seen. And, they need to understand that just devastates the financials of a company. And in many cases, that's all of your profit, your net profit that's going away. And so you've got to teach them, how this works so that they can make better decisions on behalf of the company.
Well, and I think if we tie back to last week, one of your key points was you get the behavior you reward, right? So part of that process, to your point, is educating them about the math on this stuff.
Yeah.
And then creating the incentive systems around that.
Great. We have a question. This one's for you, Jonathan. How are you defining C and D? He says, I know there's slower moving items, but do you have a specific metric that you use, I think is the question.
I think there's a number of metrics. Typically the C and D items are, if you look at your curve, the head to the tail, these are the C and D together would account for the bottom 8 or 10% of your revenue, or 8 or 10% of your volume.
Okay.
Is that what you've typically seen, Ian?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer. I'd have to think about it, but I think, yeah, it's a lot more than that of your SKUs, right? So it's 80-20, or maybe even to your point, it's 90-10. So it's a large number of SKUs and they're not turning. So, when you have a chance to sell them, you should, but they're also not price sensitive, because the fact that they're not turning means they're not popular and people aren't price shopping them. They're not looking around. They're looking forward to finding it. So I think that's probably a pretty accurate estimate. So the follow-on question is, so the same manufacturer can have A and B items and also C and D items? And yes, the answer is yes. You could have SKUs from one manufacturer that fall in every category of turns, right? They might, like a distributor, they're not, the same brand may have A, B, C, and D items.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about centralizing purchasing to buy better. So, it's funny because a lot of distributors have very distributed sourcing. So, lots of people are qualified or authorized to do what they call buyouts, for example, where I can go source an item for a customer anytime they need it. And, they kind of view that distributed sourcing as an advantage because they're flexible. We'll do anything it takes to satisfy the customer. But a lot of times what that means is you have a whole bunch of suppliers selling to you and they know what you're buying and you don't know what you're buying from them, right? So if you're sourcing a whole bunch from a master distributor, but it's happening across your organization, you're probably using a generic SKU, right? You're probably saying, look, all of our sourced items are 1A999. I'll put in a description, I'll put in a price and a cost, but you don't really know how much you're buying from that master distributor because you don't have a vendor number on that buyout, and you don't have a proper SKU on that buyout. So you're not able to aggregate that information and get smarter and buy better over time. So I don't think you can go from an organization where, 200 people are buying in a distributed fashion and, sourcing everything to meet customer needs and then immediately centralize. but I think you need to put some kind of centralization in place, because, you know, you're otherwise you have a bunch of amateurs buying from a bunch of professionals, right? You got a bunch of amateurs making purchases from people who are probably better negotiators and more savvy and better trained on how to do it. And the margin opportunity, in my experience, there is extraordinary. And putting some business rules around, you know, purchasing, and starting with something modest, purchases over a certain amount, or, you know, you limit the number of vendors that people can buy from without going to, you know, some central source. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity in here, in my experience.
And I'm curious, so you think there's a couple points of margin you could get? 3? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think it's, well, it depends on the nature of the business model and the products you're selling. I think it's hundreds of basis points. I think, because it's related to some of the other stuff that's in here about strategic buying agreements and marketing co-op and rebates. And, you know, so let's say that you run an industrial distributor and you've got, you know, 50 people in the field doing buyouts, and they're going, and you know what, typically those people are doing buyouts from McMaster Carr and Grainger and Master Distributors and Fastenal, and they're just going wherever they need to get the product, which means they're not only, you know, creating a markup for themselves, but they're paying somebody else's markup that's probably bigger than the one that you're getting, right? And let's say that they're buying, you know, $100,000 in bearings a year, but you don't know it because it's all under this generic SKU, and or a lot of it's under generic SKU. All you know is it's a buyout from Grainger, or a buyout from Fastenal, or a buyout from, you know, Bearings Plus or whatever. So you don't really know, and you're just passing that through. Well, if you actually knew that you were buying $100,000 in bearings, you could go to Timken or some other bearing manufacturer and set up a program and buy directly from the manufacturer, and you might see those costs cut very dramatically. And now your sales of those products are going to skyrocket because you're competitive and you represent a full line and you get some training and you know what you're doing. But all of those lessons are lost forever when you're blind to what you're sourcing. And so, you know, you can get into whole new product lines at very favorable margins, but you have to have the analytics around it. I think anonymous purchases have to go away. You have to find a way to identify what you're buying and from whom. That's where it starts. So even before you centralize, you need a system that allows you to know exactly what you're buying, have the manufacturer's number in there, and specify the vendor, and start aggregating the data, because you're going to find all kinds of savings from putting that data in place.
So one of our commenters has suggested that it's 3 to 7%, depending on the categories, in terms of the impact.
Yeah, I know this person. He's very knowledgeable. He's been around for a long time. I used to work for him. And my guess is that if he says it's 3 to 7%, and I think he means 300 to 700 basis points, I would not bet against that. I would say that's probably right. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So Jonathan, you want to address the next one, making web pricing consistent with contract pricing?
Sure. So when in our How to Build a Doomed Website, one of the things that we talked about was doing pricing that's going to upset your customers who have contract pricing. What you want to avoid as a situation is that the price they see online is better than their contract pricing. You will not only lose the deal, you might actually lose a customer. So this is a really broad brush statement, but I think where you want to be, you can't be perfect in this. You're going to have some situations where your web pricing is occasionally better than your contract pricing, but you want to minimize those. So the way to do that philosophically is to say, if we look at the pricing for the first decile, that's going to be your best pricing, and that's going to cover 65 to 90% of the revenue you get. So if we want to avoid this clash between web pricing and contract pricing, if you set the web pricing at about where the middle of your second decile of customers, you'll show a competitive price on the web, but you're also going to be at a price that is higher than what your biggest customers are paying. So that's a broad brush guideline. You could decide to be, closer to the first decile, closer to the third decile, but as a rough guideline, the middle of that second decile. I know you have some thoughts on this, Ian. What? What's AE?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with you. I think based on how distributors set up their business models today, that's probably the best you can do. And I certainly have worked for distributors where, the web prices are artificially high because you never want to lose $1 of gross margin that a sales rep could add onto a contract price that's artificially high. But I think, first of all, if you've got your major customers overpaying and you think you're going to trick them for a long period of time, that's probably naive. And they're going to be mad at you when they figure out that you're overcharging them, and so I think you need to be careful with that. I think the other thing is that, in all these pricing discussions, as usual, Amazon does something differently, right? I mean, Bezos says, my profitability is not my customer's problem, right? And so he's tries to be competitive first, and he's built extraordinary share with that methodology. Now, the difference between him and distributors who are sacrificing margin is his is built into a whole strategy around growth and, capitalization of the firm through extraordinary growth over a long period of time in a way that inspires analysts to recommend their stock, right? So that's not how most distributors are sacrificing margin that they could, gain for themselves. But I do think, this notion of, trying to maximize pricing on every transaction has its limits. I know you're not suggesting that, but you shouldn't be losing margin because of a bad execution, which is what a lot of what we're addressing today. But it might be that it's also possible to overprice in a way that in the long term costs you market share that you would be better off gaining.
We had a question related to this about what's known as IMAP, Internet Minimum Advertised Pricing. And the way Internet Minimum Advertised Pricing works is you are required to show a minimum advertised price, which may be different than the actual selling price. So this is essentially a control on the advertised price, but not on the actual price of the product. I'm not seeing a ton of that in distribution at this point. First of all, I mean, even a separate point is whether somebody shows their pricing without logging in. That's another piece. But I haven't come across significant cases where companies are using IMAP.
It's pretty common in construction supplies and probably some other sectors. What I find is the more sophisticated companies use it all the time, right? So with Honda, and I don't know if they've changed it, but when I was in industry, if you violated their MAP price on the internet 3 times, then you couldn't advertise their SKUs at all for several months, right? So, and they were rigorous around that. I mean, if you violate, it didn't matter who you were. If you violated that policy, then you were out of the Honda, small engine and generator marketing business for a while. And some of the power tool manufacturers are pretty rigid about it. So I think it's out there for the more sophisticated manufacturers. I think it's getting harder and harder to maintain, and so it's less likely to be around in the long run. But as of when I left industry 2.5 years ago, it was still pretty common among larger industrial manufacturers. Okay, I want to go back to web pricing consistent with contract pricing for just a minute, Jonathan. Is there a way to go through and, do you gather up your contracts with big customers and then just, you probably have SKUs at different prices on contracts with big customers, right? So do you take them and average them? Do you have an approach to doing that?
Well, again, like channel conflict, you can't eliminate channel conflict, but you can attempt to minimize it.
Right.
Right. So there are ways to analytically review the contract prices relative to your web list price, and you can see what the number of conflicts is, right? Okay. And then you could decide, how are we going to deal with this? Is this a common item? Is this an A or a B item? And we're going to place more emphasis on getting the A and the B items right relative to the contract pricing. So you don't have to, if you've got 40,000 SKUs, you may only have to do this for 500 or 1,000. So.
Got it. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. And this is putting strategic buying agreements or SBAs in place with all of your suppliers. So I've seen this done in several different large distribution companies, and it really gets back, by the way, to centralizing the purchasing. It's really hard to do this if you don't have some control of your purchasing, and you have, product managers or category managers who are negotiating with suppliers. But if you are actually negotiating annual purchasing deals for at least your bigger suppliers, you're going to get much more favorable pricing. And you can also get rebates. And the way the rebates work are exactly the way you manage. If I hit a $100,000 purchasing threshold, I get X% back on those purchases. And the suppliers have those mechanisms in place, but I find a lot of distributors don't know it, and so they're not trying to negotiate rebates. And and then taking into account the next point, they're also not trying to get marketing co-op. Marketing co-op is just this morass of confusion with distributors, and it's an area of frustration for manufacturers. And I would say, look, you need professional purchasers in your organization who understand how to negotiate SBAs, how to negotiate a standard rebate, and how to negotiate marketing co-op, because rebates and co-op are not the same thing. And most of these major manufacturers, they have a marketing co-op budget. I mean, it's hard to find sometimes because some of it's coming from headquarters and some of it's coming from the local rep, et cetera, or through the manufacturer's rep. But it's out there and it's real money, and it can be very significant. I mean, you're talking 2, 3, 5% of your purchases refunded to you in the form of marketing co-op if you earn it by doing specific marketing programs. But again, this is not the kind of thing that manufacturers volunteer because for a couple of reasons. One is they're trying to protect their own bottom line. The other one is a lot of times this money gets squandered, particularly the marketing co-op. Manufacturers get tired of paying for, golf tournaments at luxury hotels that really aren't, turning into sales, and in many cases don't even have customers there. But I think, understanding how SBAs work, understanding how rebates work, understanding how co-op works, and then, centralizing your purchasing, putting professionals in charge of it, and figuring out how you maximize your return on that, that is an extraordinary amount of money. And here's the thing, it doesn't raise your prices to your customers one bit. In some cases, you can lower the pricing, but you're talking about an enormous amount of profitability that all comes from upstream, from your suppliers. And by the way, most suppliers are okay with this, because if you're going to the effort of earning this money, you're probably growing with them. You're probably saying, look, we've got, right now 5 suppliers of hand tools. We're going to go to 2. And so as a result, those 2 get a lot more business from you. So they're happy in that situation to negotiate a lower price and, co-op and rebates in exchange for more volume, instead of just this disorganized shotgun approach that a lot of distributors follow. So this is a whole area of expertise and professionalism and process that is just handled, sort of ad hoc in a messy fashion by distributors today.
I think it's instructive on this, like particularly the co-op, to look at what happens in retail. So if you look at supermarkets or grocery chains, huge portion of their profit, their bottom line profit, is tied to marketing co-op dollars.
Yeah,
it's tied to MDF, and they absolutely depend on that, which can be an issue in what they want to do with private label. Is their private label potentially conflicting with one of the suppliers they have, one of the brands that they're selling to get the co-op? But at the end of the day, it's a significant number. And I think what you're saying is that it's also a significant number in wholesale.
It is. It's very significant, and there's and all kinds of good things come out of it, right? So, for example, a lot of times manufacturers have promotions in place, and they're not properly implemented in the organization at the distributor level because no one's really responsible for it. So this district will do it and that district won't. There's no organization. Well, if you actually have a category manager who is in charge of putting together a plan for that category, that promotion can be planned out months in advance because it's done professionally by an expert who knows what she's doing, and she's able to plan this out so that the distributor grows sales and earns their way up to another discount tier. And you get people who know how to negotiate inventory strategies, like, hey, if I'm going from 5 hand tool suppliers to 2, one of the things that's very common is those 2 will buy your inventory that you're displacing from the 3 suppliers you're discontinuing. A lot of people don't know that. Those manufacturers will buy that dead inventory from their competitors that you have on hand to sell you more of their inventory, because it's, they view it as, hey, once I get that stuff in stock, I'm going to sell it for a long time. So I'm going to make an investment in this relationship. And that you're not going to get that from some local branch manager thinking he's negotiated a great deal with some local hand tool supplier. You've got to get some alignment around this across the organization if you want to maximize pricing, if you want to maximize inventory performance, if you want to maximize sales promotions and sales growth, if you want to maximize rebates and co-op. And distributors are not many. I would say the distributors that I meet with, 1 in 10 at most is doing this reasonably well. The others, it's all an area of opportunity. And every time you talk about profit, all they think about is raising prices. This is a way that you can make an enormous difference in your profitability, and you don't raise prices at all. And I already said that, but it bears repeating. Profitability is not just about how well you sell. It's also about how well you buy. And you should ask yourself, how well am I buying? What's the opportunity there? Because that can have an enormous impact on your profitability without taking any risk with customers.
However, I think that a lot of distributors, when they think about profitability, are more focused upstream, meaning supplier facing, than customer facing. There's a lot of cultural change in shifting pricing. And I've heard some really amazing stories about companies that were implementing a pricing solution and the cultural change that it triggered. One where there were adults who'd been with the company for a long time, male and female, in tears because of the changes they were being asked to make. They were being asked to raise prices to their buddies, right? To their longtime friends that were their customers. And so I think that the focus on pricing, there are people in distribution that know that, but I think the knee-jerk reaction is, well, how can I do something on the supplier-facing side of things? Because in some ways it's harder, it seems harder to go ask customers for, or to demand more from customers in pricing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just a difference in experience thing, because I see people work, as soon as you talk about raising margins, that is synonymous with price increases for them. Mm-hmm. And, I think, even the title of this webinar, we probably should have called it Profit Improvement Hacks rather than Pricing Hacks, right? And, if you have someone responsible for profitability in your distribution company, you should probably call them a director of profitability, not a director of pricing, because it, puts the focus on the more robust, sort of full treatment of the problem rather than just focusing on selling prices.
Better yet, Chief Profit Officer.
Chief Profit Officer, it's the CPO. I like that.
Because then you can start looking at other things. So we mostly been looking at gross margin, but a good Chief Profit Officer is also going to be looking at cost to serve, and there are greater differences between customers in the cost to serve than there are differences in the cost of goods of specific products. So there's actually a really big opportunity there to start to think about cost to serve, to actually reward customers with better pricing if their cost to serve is low. What we've seen when we've gone and done profit analyses is that the difference in segments, we did this for one distributor, their PVF distributor sold to industrial buyers and they sold to mechanical contractors. The industrial segment was literally 5 times as profitable as the contractor segment, and it was because of the differences in the cost to serve. So for every dollar they sold in industrial, they had to sell $5 to get this in the mechanical segment to get the same profit.
So is there a hack around that? I mean, is there a hack that you can use to try to get some benefit around cost to serve that we can throw into this discussion?
Well, I think getting in all of this discussion, it's about getting the right analytics to make the decisions. So if it's pricing, you got to have the right analytics. If it's cost to serve, you got to have the right analytics. Ian, as you know, we've done a lot of work with Waypoint, and there are other players in the space now that are starting to offer analytics around cost to serve. I think, you have to get the analytics there in the first place. In the absence of analytics, a decent proxy for cost to serve is the gross profit dollars in an order. So we're doing an analysis right now for a company who they don't have the analytics on the cost to serve. And we see that their contractor segment of small contractors, 1 to 10, the gross profit dollars per order is $79, which is probably not making a lot of money. And if you go up to the next segment of contractors, 11 to 50, the gross profit dollars is $120 per order on average. So if we're looking in the spirit of hack, meaning a shortcut, in the absence of those tools, I would say that's probably the best hack you can provide.
Okay. All right. So it's gross margin dollars per order.
Yeah.
I'm trying to drive that. All right. Hey, by the way, I cannot read the Q&A for some reason. So can you see if we have any questions? For some reason,
sure.
it won't open for me.
So we have a question from Jason. Do you think COVID or the circumstances caused by it will make pricing shifts easier to make or justify?
I think COVID will make pricing shifts easier to justify.
Meaning up or down?
Yeah.
I think it's going to depend on the product. I was talking to one of our customers, and they're having a tremendous difficulty getting gloves in the PPE category. And they're seeing incredibly onerous, supplier favorable terms on getting gloves. So I think it's going to depend on the category. Things that are in really, really short supply, you're going to have a easier time pushing those prices up.
Yeah, I would caution people against price gouging though, because, it's unethical, first of all, and secondly, people have long memories about that kind of thing.
Yeah. You can be a Pyrrhic victory. You can win the battle, lose the war.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So I think that's good. I think you're right. It's certain types of products. I think, the whole COVID story though isn't about pricing. It's about, did you have the right digital capabilities going into this pandemic? Because if you did, you won. And if you didn't, you lost. It was pretty much that simple.
Great. Next question was, or just suggestion for the title. How about Chief Value Officer? So that brings up a really, really great point. If we think about pricing, so I teach pricing, full disclosure, at the University of Colorado Business School. The perspective of value in the channel is different than the perspective of value from the supplier. So when suppliers or manufacturers set pricing, if they're doing their work right, they should really be understanding the value of their product to the customer who's going to use it. The channel doesn't have as much latitude around that in terms of really understanding value. They might understand value for a small set of SKUs or for their primary brands or primary product categories. I like the focus on value. I'm curious what you think about the title Chief Value Officer, Ian.
Yeah, I kind of like it. I mean, I think, I think the problem with all these chief titles is it's hard to get C-level titles for something like profitability. So you're probably going to get maybe director of value or director of profitability. I think anything's more holistic than pricing. So whether it's got a chief in front of it or a director, I think there's merit to it. I think we covered the push-up prices on C&D items to small customers, right?
We did.
Okay, so the next point for you podcast listeners is tie sales rep compensation to gross margin percentage growth or graduated commissions, so higher commissions on higher profitability items. What do you think about that, Jonathan?
Well, I think this is, we were talking about, you've got a real estate agent, you got a property for $250,000, you've got $50,000 in it, and he or she's got a, 5% commission on it. If they discount $10,000 on the price, you just lost 20% of your equity, and they just lost $600. So
yeah.
What we want to do is we want to make sure that there's alignment between the company and the rep who's selling. So the idea with the graduated commissions comes down to two things. One, what are you actually giving commission on? And two, how does it play into total quota for the year? So a technique that I've seen that's powerful is you take the actual gross profit dollars, and if it's within a certain range, that is the basis for the commission. I'm sorry, if the gross margin is within a certain range on that, that becomes the basis for the commission and the quota. If the pricing is, the gross margin is above a certain level, you can actually put in multipliers. So even though it was technically $10,000 of gross profit dollars, the multiplier says, well, we're actually going to make it $12,000 of gross profit dollars. That's the basis for commission as well as contributing to your quota. And conversely, the other side, if the gross percentage margin is too low, you can put a multiplier that reduces that $10,000 to $8,000. So I think that's a really powerful way to start to get alignment between what the company wants and what the reps are doing on the street.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of distributors, they pay on a flat gross margin basis. So, or the sales reps get X percentage of all gross margin dollars sold. And I think that's a misalignment in many ways, like with the realtor, right? I mean, realtors want you to sell your house for less because it only costs them a little, but they can vastly decrease the number of units they sell per year because it's easier to sell a cheaper house. But you're only selling one house that year. And so it doesn't work for you as a seller, which was your point, right?
Right.
Same thing with sales reps. It's like, well, hey, if I get paid on gross margin dollars, I'm going to create as many gross margin dollars as I can. And I'm going to try not to lose any. So if I have to discount to move more volume, because remember, it's a lot easier to sell if you're the cheapest game in town. I'm just going to try to drive gross margin dollar volume. But in many cases, that doesn't really work for the distributor. So I do think this idea of either requiring growth in order to earn commissions, or tying GM percentage growth to commissions, or just doing graduated commissions, like you said, where it's like, okay, you get 3% of commissions at this gross margin percentage, and you get 4% of gross margin dollars at this percentage. I mean, I think graduating like that makes sense.
Another variant of this, which we've started to see some of, is instead of tying things to gross margin, actually tying it to operating margin of some kind. And those experiments are newer. I've started to hear some success with them. It's big cultural change to get that through an organization. Again, like I said before, you have to have the analytics to pull that off. But then at that point, you and the sales rep are aligned, and
I get the academic appeal of that. I think my concern is that pricing systems need to be very simple and understandable to account managers, because if they're not, they don't believe them. And I think, you start talking about operating dollars and you're throwing in a lot of costs, and there's a lot of arguments about how, well, that cost didn't really go up just because I sold that next order. You're just taking an average. Right. And so I think, there's some appeal there, and I understand that, but I'm skeptical that you can get people to understand it versus just, hey, it was a 20% margin item, so here's the profit, and I get a percentage of that.
That is definitely the flip side of that. You can, it's the measurement is more disputable.
Okay. Our last topic before we close is limiting pricing authority in an organization. Have you seen success with this, Jonathan?
Yeah, and I think we've all seen the converse of that, or the opposite of that, where the pricing authority is at the point where the customer touches, meaning where the sales rep or the CSR has too much pricing authority. So I think what I've seen in best practices is where companies can, similar to the purchasing, can start to centralize the pricing authority. Any movement towards that tends to be a win in reining in wanton, for lack of a better term, field sales reps and their pricing.
And customer service people.
And customer service, yeah. And any of the customer-facing personnel that are making those decisions, right?
Yeah. I think you need to set some pretty severe limits on the amount of latitude that people have for pricing. And I think I told you this morning that when I was at Grainger a million years ago, account managers were actually paid based on gross sales, which everybody says is the wrong thing to do. But the pricing controls were so strict that that really, protected the ability of the company to earn higher gross margins. And I don't think that's a good thing to do, but it worked. And now that was a base and commission environment, but nobody actually knew the cost, and you do kind of have to reveal cost if you want to do base commissions based on gross margin dollars, or at least some form of cost, and or gross margin percentage. And so, I think, at Grainger, you had very little pricing authority. I mean, even branch managers, and all the exceptions were reported up the chain. And so I think you can control margins pretty well with that. I'm not suggesting that's the right way to do it. Looks like we have one more question. Can you look it up?
Yeah, you bet. This is one of our favorite commenters, limiting pricing authority in capital letters. That point in itself will drive greater than 1% additional gross margin.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. I think, you've got to get control of it. It's your, if you're responsible, if you're the general manager and you're responsible for the profitability of your company, then you need to get your hands around this. There's no choice, because there's such an enormous amount of opportunity. And remember, if you ever go to sell the company, it's done on a multiple of your profits, multiple of EBITDA. And so, if you improve another dollar to the bottom line, that might be 7 to 10 times dollars that you get when you sell it. So it has a huge impact on the valuation of the company, and frankly, on your ability to pay, to hire, train, and compensate good people. You got to make money to do that. Okay. Anything else you want to throw in there, Jonathan, before we wrap up?
Well, I think there's a lot here, and there's a lot that's untapped by a lot of distributors. And so, going back to that first point, the power of 1%, each of these hacks that we've mentioned is probably a greater than 1% impact, right? And so if you can get a few of these, if you're like most distributors in terms of your EBITDA, single digit percentages, you can have a material impact on profitability. And although the title of this, what was the title? Painless? These I would not say that these things are painless.
I think I wrote that title.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say they're painless, but they're worthwhile. Yeah. Because you can see the companies that get excellence in profit management, in pricing, in buying, and managing co-op, in how they manage their reps, the systems they have in place. You can see the companies that do that. And we get it, and we're working with a company right now that has just exceptional pricing discipline. It's about as clean as I've ever seen it. And it really jumps out. So it is possible to do that. It's possible to make these changes. So right. I would encourage people to take this seriously, to not get distracted by the bright, shiny object of additional market share, and say instead, how do we look at additional profitability? That's that power of 1% on the profitability side is going to have much greater impact than another point of sales volume.
Yeah, I would add to that I agree with everything you said. I think one thing to keep in mind is that you can't force faith. You have to let people sort of learn as they go. So I think you can take control of your profit future. You can drive a lot of change, but make sure you're communicating and over communicating and training and giving people the opportunity to buy in over time. You can't just shove it down everyone's throats, right? And so there is some cultural change here that will help you win over time. But you do want to get the organization to buy into this and not just be in a forced compliance mode.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, great talking to you. This will be available on podcast and an archive webcast. That's a wrap for Wholesale Change for the week. Jonathan, it's been great talking to you as always, and we'll see you next week.